If someone told you 6 months ago that the streets of Tehran would be covered with the bodies of thousands of protesters gunned down by their own government, that the supreme leader of Iran would publicly admit to ordering the killings of his own citizens, that the United States would send one of the largest naval armadas in recent memory to the Persian Gulf, and that all of this would culminate in the most dangerous nuclear standoff since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you would have called it the plot of a Hollywood thriller. But this is not fiction. This is January and February of 2026. And it all started with the price of bread. On December 28th of 2025, shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, one of the oldest and most politically significant marketplaces in the Middle East, closed their shutters and walked out. The Iranian rial had collapsed to a historic low against the dollar. Inflation was devouring salaries. Electricity and water cuts had become routine. The currency crisis was the final trigger, but the rage was about everything. Decades of repression, civil rights abuses, government corruption, and a theocratic system that had promised divine governance but delivered economic ruin. Within 48 hours, the protests spread from Tehran to Isfahan, Kermanshah, Shiraz, Malad, Nahavand, and dozens of smaller cities and towns across all 31 provinces. What began as economic frustration evolved almost overnight into something the Islamic Republic feared more than any foreign military threat: a nationwide demand for regime change. Protesters chanted, "Death to the dictator," in direct reference to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. They waved the pre-revolutionary lion and sun flag, a monarchist symbol banned since 1979. They attacked symbols of the government and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. University students joined the Bazaari merchants. Young men took over from the women who had led the Woman Life Freedom movement in 2022. And the exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, son of the last Shah, intensified his political efforts from abroad, calling on the international community to support regime change and offering himself as interim leader. President Masoud Pezeshkian, who had been elected in 2024 on promises of good governance and internet freedom, initially attempted a conciliatory approach. He acknowledged the economic grievances and called for dialogue. State-run media, in a rare move, actually covered the protests on television, framing them as driven by the economic crisis. But Pezeshkian also pressed for national unity against external threats, a tone that hardened dramatically after US President Donald Trump began publicly backing the protesters and threatening military intervention. What happened next would become the largest government massacre of civilians in modern Iranian history, a systematic campaign of killing that observers compared to Tiananmen Square. On January 8th of 2026, the regime crossed the line from crowd control into military extermination. According to leaked classified documents later obtained by the People's Mojahedin organization and revealed by the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the Supreme National Security Council, under the direction of Secretary Ali Larijani, shifted from police containment to military suppression, granting the IRGC full authority to use lethal force against unarmed civilians. The New York Times reported that Khamenei gave a direct order to the Supreme National Security Council to crush the protests by any means necessary. Iran International confirmed that the heads of all three branches of government had explicit knowledge and gave their approval. The orders given to security forces were, in the words of the Times, to shoot to kill and to show no mercy. What followed on January 8th and 9th was a coordinated massacre across more than 400 cities and 31 provinces. Security forces opened fire on crowds with live ammunition and heavy machine guns. Snipers were deployed from pre-identified elevated positions, locations that had been mapped and prepared since 2022, according to the leaked NCRI documents. The regime simultaneously cut off all internet access to isolate protesters from the outside world and prevent real-time evidence of the killings from reaching international media. Hospitals in Tehran and Shiraz were overwhelmed by gunshot victims. The Guardian documented multiple reports of security forces opening fire on demonstrations, with one eyewitness stating they saw hundreds of bodies across Tehran in a single night of carnage that shocked even veteran observers of Iranian politics. The death toll is staggering and still climbing. Internal estimates from Iran's own Ministry of Health indicated at least 30,000 people were killed in the first 48 hours alone. Tehran's government officially acknowledged 3,117 deaths, claiming 2,447 were civilians and security forces combined, and the rest were what they called terrorists. But independent human rights organizations paint a far more devastating picture. As of early February 2026, the US-based human rights activists news agency documented 6,941 confirmed deaths, of whom at least 6,495 were protesters, with 11,630 additional cases still under review. A network of doctors inside Iran estimated the true number could exceed 30,000. The brutality extended beyond the killing fields. The Iranian government arrested over 42,000 people during the crackdown. The Tehran prosecutor declared that an undeclared number of protesters would be charged with muhareba, or waging war against God, an offense punishable by death that the regime has used extensively to suppress dissent under the guise of religious law. Families of killed protesters were forced to pay the state for the bullets used to murder their loved ones before they could reclaim the bodies. Plainclothes IRGC agents were embedded within protest crowds with orders to disrupt anti-Khamenei chants by redirecting slogans toward pro-monarchy rhetoric, a tactic designed to fracture opposition unity and confuse public messaging about the movement's true character. The leaked NCRI documents revealed that this massacre was not a panicked reaction, but the execution of a standing order, a specific escalating strategy of suppression personally approved by Khamenei years in advance. The planning began after the 2019 nationwide protests and was refined after the Woman Life Freedom Movement of 2022. The preparations included marking and identifying elevated locations for sniper deployment, ideological and psychological training to prepare security forces to kill, including instructions on firing final shots at wounded protesters, and training criminal elements to infiltrate gatherings as fake protest leaders, to both identify participants and steer movements in directions favorable to the regime's narrative. Khamenei himself eventually acknowledged that thousands of people had been killed, but blamed U.S. President Trump for inciting the violence and labeled all protesters as rioters and terrorists affiliated with the American and Israeli governments. In a February 1st speech to regime loyalists, Khamenei deliberately described the uprising as a coup, a calculated choice of words designed to erase the popular nature of the movement and whitewash the mass killings by reversing the roles of perpetrator and victim. The international community responded with a wave of condemnation. The European Union announced new sanctions and moved to proscribe the IRGC. The United Kingdom designated 10 individuals and the Iranian law enforcement forces under its sanctions regime. Australia imposed targeted sanctions against senior IRGC officials responsible for the crackdown. But the most dramatic international response came from Washington. As the death toll mounted in January, President Trump initially voiced concern for the protesters in a social media post, declaring that he had cancelled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops, adding the words, "Help is on its way." Trump later claimed his threats of military force had stopped Iranian authorities from executing more than 800 detained protesters, though Iranian officials denied any such plans existed. Then on January 23rd, Trump escalated dramatically, announcing that a massive armada was heading toward Iran, describing it as a larger fleet than the one sent to Venezuela weeks earlier when U.S. Special Forces had snatched President Maduro. The USS Abraham Lincoln, one of 10 nuclear-powered Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and among the largest warships ever built, at 333 meters long, was diverted from operations in the South China Sea toward the Middle East. The carrier, capable of hosting over 65 aircraft and supporting a crew of 5,680 people, brought with it squadrons of F/A-18E Super Hornet fighter jets, E-2D Hawkeye surveillance aircraft, and electronic warfare platforms. 3 guided missile destroyers accompanied the Lincoln: the USS Frank E. Petersen, Jr., the USS Spruance, and the USS Michael Murphy, all equipped with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets deep inside Iranian territory from hundreds of miles away. The carrier strike group was just the centerpiece of a much larger military buildup. The guided missile destroyers USS McFaul and USS Mitscher were already positioned near the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Bulkeley and USS Roosevelt operated in the eastern Mediterranean. 3 littoral combat ships, the USS Santa Barbara, USS Canberra, and USS Tulsa, were stationed in Bahrain, equipped with mine countermeasure packages, essential for any conflict where Iran attempts to mine the Strait of Hormuz, through which more than a fifth of the world's oil flows daily. Additional terminal high-altitude area defense systems and Patriot missile batteries were deployed to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest American military installation in the Middle East and CENTCOM's forward headquarters. The air buildup was equally aggressive. Approximately 35 F-15E Strike Eagles deployed to Jordan. Tanker aircraft surged to Al Udeid. At least 8 tankers crossed the Atlantic in a single day, landing at Morón Air Base in southern Spain, while supporting at least 7 additional fighter-sized aircraft on the transatlantic crossing. RC-135 reconnaissance planes capable of detecting radioactive debris and interpreting electromagnetic signals arrived in the region. Surveillance flights by U.S. drones and reconnaissance aircraft operated at near constant pace from bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and beyond, patrolling the Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf around the clock. The Middle East Forum's analysis described it as the largest American military buildup in the region since the June 2025 strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. The June 2025 precedent loomed large over every aspect of this confrontation. During Israel's 12-day war with Iran that summer, the United States had joined the conflict by launching 30 Tomahawk missiles from submarines and carrying out B-2 bomber strikes against 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, significantly damaging or destroying enrichment sites, including Fordo. Iran had retaliated with an unprecedented missile strike targeting Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where 1 ballistic missile impacted the facility and damaged a radome. In January 2026, as tensions escalated again, a partial evacuation of Al Udeid was ordered, with hundreds of personnel relocated and 6 KC-135 tankers departing the base in a single evening, signaling just how seriously the military was taking the threat of Iranian retaliation. Trump's rhetoric oscillated between maximum pressure and diplomatic overture. On January 16th, he claimed Iran had stopped killing protesters, a claim unverifiable given the internet blackout. By January 23rd, he was describing the massive armada heading toward the Gulf. He warned Tehran that if it did not agree to a nuclear deal, the next attack would be far worse than June. When asked if he wanted Khamenei to step down, Trump replied that he did not want to get into that, but that they know what we want, and that there is a lot of killing. The ambiguity was itself a weapon. As one intelligence analyst told The Hill, the objectives remained intentionally ambiguous, meaning a wider range of possibilities and retaliatory scenarios were under consideration, keeping Tehran guessing about whether diplomacy or destruction was coming. Iran's response was defiant. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posted on social media that while Iran stood ready for dialogue based on mutual respect, its armed forces were prepared with their fingers on the trigger to immediately and powerfully respond to any aggression against Iranian land, air, and sea. The IRGC conducted a test launch of a Khorramshahr 4 ballistic missile capable of reaching Israel and U.S. bases across the region, deploying it from a mobile launcher extracted from an underground base. IRGC political deputy Yadollah Javani declared that unveiling the missile meant that although Iran had sat down at the negotiating table, it would not surrender its military power. The Islamic Republic's UN mission warned that if pushed, it would defend itself and respond like never before. The confrontation between American naval power and Iranian defiance created a crisis atmosphere across the entire Middle East that disrupted global commerce and air travel. International airlines, including Air France, Turkish Airlines, Pegasus, A-Jet, Indigo, and Air India cancelled or rerouted flights over Iranian airspace. Shipping in the Persian Gulf dipped sharply as cargo companies reassessed the risk of operating near Iranian waters. Insurance costs for tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz spiked dramatically. 9 countries from the region reached out to the White House at the highest levels, strongly urging the United States not to cancel diplomatic channels with Tehran, fearing that a military confrontation could spiral into a regional war with consequences dwarfing anything seen in the June conflict. Behind the scenes, a diplomatic lifeline was being constructed. Regional allies, particularly Oman, worked to bring Iran back to the negotiating table. The talks had initially been planned for Istanbul in a multilateral format that would have included topics beyond nuclear issues, such as Tehran's ballistic missile program and the protest crackdown. Iran rejected this broader framework, insisting on bilateral talks focused solely on nuclear issues, held in Oman rather than Turkey. The US initially rejected these conditions, with a senior official telling Axios that they told the Iranians it is this or nothing, and they said, okay, then nothing. But after at least 9 Middle Eastern governments lobbied Washington intensely, the administration reversed course, agreeing to hold the meeting to be respectful to allies and to continue pursuing the diplomatic track. On February 6th of 2026, the talks finally took place in Muscat, Oman's capital. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi met with Omani Foreign Minister Saeed Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi, who then shuttled messages to the American delegation led by Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. In a remarkable first, Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner joined the negotiations alongside U.S. Central Command Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, whose presence in dress uniform at the diplomatic table served as an unmistakable reminder that the USS Abraham Lincoln and its strike group were positioned just off the Iranian coast, ready to execute whatever orders might follow a breakdown in talks. The talks were indirect, mediated by Oman, with neither side meeting face-to-face. Araghchi presented a preliminary plan to manage the current situation between Iran and the United States. The key point of contention remained Iran's demand to retain uranium enrichment capabilities, which the US and its allies categorically reject. Before the June war, Iran had been enriching uranium to 60% purity, a short technical step from weapons-grade levels. The White House position under Trump was unambiguous: zero nuclear capability. Iran offered to place checks on its program to ensure it was not weaponized, demanding the lifting of crippling sanctions in return. The gap between these positions remained enormous, but both sides described the initial exchange as positive. Araghchi told Iranian state television that the talks got off to a good start in a very positive atmosphere, though he emphasized that any dialogue must take place without threats and pressure, an implicit demand that the US withdraw or reduce its naval buildup as a precondition for continued negotiations. He noted the deep distrust between the two countries, formed particularly after the US strikes on Iranian nuclear sites in June, which had destroyed facilities that were the subject of the very negotiations being conducted at the time. Trump, speaking to reporters, called the talks very good and said they would continue early the following week. Oman's foreign minister described them as very serious and said both sides would consult with their capitals before reconvening. But even as diplomatic words were being exchanged in Muscat, Washington signaled it would maintain economic pressure. On the same day the talks concluded, the United States rolled out new sanctions on Iranian oil exports and 14 vessels carrying Iranian crude. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Tommy Pigott declared that instead of investing in the welfare of its own people and crumbling infrastructure, the Iranian regime continues to fund destabilizing activities around the world and step up its repression inside Iran. The simultaneous diplomacy and sanctions approach mirrored the administration's strategy with other adversaries, using carrots and sledgehammers in the same 24-hour news cycle to keep the other side permanently off balance. The strategic calculus for both sides is extraordinarily complex and layered with historical betrayal. Iran entered these talks carrying the memory of the 2015 nuclear deal that Trump unilaterally abandoned in 2018 during his first term, reimposing sanctions that devastated the Iranian economy. Then came the June 2025 strikes that destroyed nuclear facilities while negotiations were still theoretically active. From Tehran's perspective, the United States has proven repeatedly that it cannot be trusted to honor agreements, making any new deal an exercise in calculated risk, where the potential for betrayal must be weighed against the certainty of continued economic collapse and potential military destruction of whatever remains of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. For Washington, the challenge is equally formidable. Analysts at the National Interest warned that a US-Iran clash could spiral out of control in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Iran retains the capability to target commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, not necessarily through sustained closure, but through episodic and deniable actions that raise insurance costs, slow traffic, and inject uncertainty into global energy markets. Tehran could mobilize proxy networks across the region to strike Israel and US bases. And Iran's parliamentary representative from Qom publicly warned that Iran must prepare for worst-case scenarios, including the targeting or occupation of Karg Island, Iran's main oil export terminal, suggesting that some in Tehran were already gaming out a full-scale confrontation with American military power. The Iranian people, meanwhile, remain trapped between a regime that massacres its own citizens and an international community that condemns the violence but ultimately did not intervene to stop it. Despite the internet blackout, reports emerged of dancing at funerals of massacre victims as a form of resistance. Students at Mashhad Azad University held memorial ceremonies for killed classmates. The One Word Lawyers Network called on the international community and Iranian judges to prevent show trials and extrajudicial executions. Reza Pahlavi addressed Khamenei directly, declaring that just as Nazi criminals were tried and punished at Nuremberg, Khamenei and his accomplices would be tried in the court of the Iranian nation. His mother, former Empress Farah Pahlavi, told Agence France Presse there was no turning back and that her return to Iran would take place soon. As of early February 2026, the protests have been largely suppressed through overwhelming military force, mass arrests, and an information blackout that continues to limit internet access across the country. But the regime's apparent victory may be Pyrrhic. The Iranian rial has reached another record low. International isolation is deepening as the European Union, United Kingdom, Australia, and United States impose successive rounds of sanctions targeting the IRGC, senior officials, and economic sectors. The government increased security spending by nearly 150%, while offering wage increases amounting to only about 2/5 of the rate of inflation. Her formula guaranteed to produce further economic deterioration and popular resentment that cannot be permanently suppressed by bullets alone. The USS Abraham Lincoln remains positioned in the northern Arabian Sea. Additional destroyers and missile defense systems continue operating across the Gulf. Surveillance flights maintain near-constant coverage of Iranian military installations and the Strait of Hormuz. The next round of nuclear talks in Oman has been agreed upon in principle, but no date has been set. The gap between American demands for zero nuclear capability and Iran's insistence on enrichment rights remains as wide as the Persian Gulf itself, and the bodies of thousands of protesters lie in graves that the regime does not want the world to count. In a country where the internet remains throttled, the courts threaten dissenters with execution for waging war against God, and the supreme leader calls a nationwide uprising a coup. This is not a crisis that will resolve itself through a single round of indirect talks mediated by Oman. This is a collision between an authoritarian regime fighting for survival, a superpower projecting overwhelming military force to extract concessions, and a population that has crossed the psychological threshold where the fear of death no longer outweighs the fury of living under tyranny. The June 2025 strikes prove the United States is willing to hit Iranian nuclear sites. The January 2026 massacre proved Khamenei is willing to kill tens of thousands of his own people to maintain power, and the Armada sitting off the Iranian coast proves that the window for diplomatic resolution is measured not in months or years, but in days and decisions made by a handful of men in Washington, Tehran, and Muscat who hold the fate of millions in their calculations. Every carrier strike group eventually returns to port. Every diplomatic channel eventually produces either an agreement or an ultimatum. Every suppressed uprising eventually resurfaces in a population that remembers its dead. The Iranian people chanted death to the dictator in the streets and paid for those words with their lives. The question now is whether the world will remember their sacrifice when the next round of talks produces carefully worded communiques about positive atmospheres and continued consultations, or whether the blood on the streets of Tehran and Isfahan and Kermanshah will become another chapter in the long history of massacres that the international community condemned in press conferences and then quietly forgot while the killers remained in power and the victims remained in the ground.